today we are really happy to have with us Mr. Jeffrey Say, who will talk on Singapore painting from the 1950s to the 70s. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jeffrey Say.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for making the time to attend this talk. And good to see that a lot of people are interested in Singapore art. Yeah, as Ashif said, I'm currently as my full-time job, I'm currently the program leader of the MA Asian Art Histories program at LASALLE. We run about 6 MA programs, and I think I'll be talking a little bit more about that later on because I brought some prospectus, which I'm going to kind of distribute for those who are interested. All right, we only have about an hour and 10-15 minutes, so I'm going to have to kind of not speed up, but not to tell any long stories, I suppose. Okay, I'll be a bit more concise. Okay, I think I need to make a couple of points before we start. One is this, that because I only have a limited time, there's only so much I can cover in terms of movements and also in terms of artists. So at the end of the talk, you may be wondering, why is this artist not mentioned in the talk, right? I suppose we can take that up in Q&A. Right? I mean, there's always this question about inclusion and exclusion, right? And secondly, for this talk, I'm also drawing a few works to show you from the NLB collection, and I think you can see them at various floors. I think 7, 8, 9 floors, right? So you can actually see these works that I'm showing you, right? In fact, right, even after the talk, you can see them in person, firsthand. All right. I think only maybe a few of you have seen a show by on painting by Singaporean artists in the past. But I think that says a lot as well, right, about the scene today, the painting scene. Okay, and I think it's a valid question to ask whether painting is dying or is it already dead in Singapore art. I suppose that's a question maybe we can discuss briefly later. And this is in sharp contrast to what I'm going to cover today, the period which is from the 50s to the 70s, right? And if you can take a moment to read these 2 quotes. The first quote is by Lok Wan Tho, and Lok Wan Tho is probably the greatest patron of the arts, right? Back in the 1950s, he's the founder of curated organization, right? And he says that he was referring to a particular exhibition. And he says that in the exhibition there were over 160 pictures. 160 pictures. Okay, and and the artists were from different races, right? Malay, Chinese, Indian, and also American, British. Right? And the other quote is by the Singapore Artist, which is a supplement, and it says that in the first 8 weeks of 1955, right? Okay, the visual arts, and I suppose it's referring to painting, okay, have received more attention and publicity than any other period in local history. Okay, and there have been 7 exhibitions, 7 broadcasts, 6 public lectures, wow, I mean, there's a lot of shows, right, and talks. Okay, and this kind of, I suppose, debunk, right, this perception or that Singapore was a cultural desert back in the 50s or even the 60s, right? I mean, the scene then, judging by these quotations and judging by documentary records and archival records, is that the scene at that time was even more vibrant, I would say, than it is today, right? We always think, in the press, you always see how, vibrant, like Gilman Barracks. Actually, it's not really vibrant, right? Gilman Barracks on weekdays is like, is deserted. But at that time, in the 50s, it was a vibrant art scene. And it was, these are, and certain key developments took place during this period. All right, firstly, we have the emergence of what we call modern art. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a while. Okay, it was really a period of innovation and experimentation. And I suppose the kind of art that developed, the modern art, was rather different from that of the West. Okay, modern art here, the West tried to throw, in a sense, it was a rebellion against tradition and realism and classical art. right? But modern art here, would not hesitate to incorporate, for example, local cultures and traditions, all right? And also in this period, you'll see different modes of representation, different styles emerging, the Nanyang movement, right? Social realism, abstraction. Okay, and also there was a proliferation of art groups, art collectives, art groups. You also see, during this period, it was a tumultuous period in Singapore history. As you know, Singapore was, in a sense, fighting for independence. Okay, there were a lot of riots and strikes, and so artists kind of responded to the kind of social and political milieu at that time. Okay, which I suppose make the art during this period a very interesting one. So I suppose there's this term modern, which is a term of contention. People are still debating as to what modern actually means. Okay, I suppose in the context of my talk, right, I would take modern as to mean a kind of a point of maturity, right, in Singapore art, where the environment, the right mix of environment, stimulations, and innovative efforts all come about at the same time, okay, to allow for this distinctive or distinct flowering of artistic innovation. All right, so I think that's maybe, to me, that's one of the kind of hallmark of modern art, right, that emerged in Singapore. Okay, but this is really in contrast to, for example, the term modern as used by the Modern Art Society, which itself was influenced by, in a sense, Western aesthetic and internationalism. And to the Modern Art Society, modern art refers to the departure from mainstream Chinese migrant art. Okay, meaning to say that modern art really was an embrace of innovation and experimentation, as can be seen in abstraction, for example. All right, so to the Modern Art Society, abstraction and I mean the move towards abstraction itself, and abstraction itself was seen as a kind of a benchmark for modern art. So there are several, you'll find that there are several definitions of the modern or modern art, right? Which is, I suppose, still being discussed, right, today. But I suppose I would like more to lean on the first definition. And with that definition, you can include, for example, even the Nanyang art movement as something that is modern. So talking about the Nanyang art movement, I think, many of you are kind of acquainted with this movement and some of its artists, right? You can see them at the National Gallery, Singapore. Just a short kind of background is that before the Nanyang movement in the 1950s, right, in the previous, let's say, 2 decades, all right, Singapore art was really shaped by migrant artists who came from China. Okay, they came down from China, they settled here, they formed societies, organized exhibitions, right? But still, at that time, in the previous 2 decades, 30s, 40s, okay, art at that time was still at either extreme. So you have the Chinese ink painters painting in the Chinese tradition, pictorial tradition, and then you have artists who, painted in the Western tradition. Let's say post-impressionism, was very popular, right? But with the Nanyang movement, okay, I think Singapore art entered into a kind of a period of innovation, and we'll see why. Okay, and this term Nanyang is a Chinese name for a geographical region south of China, right? So from China, you look at the region south, and this is referred to as, Nanyang, or Southeast Asia, okay, the Southern Ocean. So many Chinese, settle in this part of the world, in Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia. Okay, and I suppose the migrant settlers, okay, the writers, the artists who came from China, they were trying to find their own identity in this part of the region, right? So in their works, gradually they tried to incorporate local subject matter as well. So this term Nanyang actually first appeared not in visual arts, but in literary criticism, right, where writers, use this region as their subject matter. I suppose one of the foremost scholars of the Nanyang movement. Now, Actually, I prefer to use the word movement rather than style, okay? Because, the different artists within this movement have actually different styles. They don't have one singular style, right? So I prefer to use the word movement, and the foremost kind of scholar of this Nanyang movement is T.K. Sabapati. And I'm glad he just released his book, right? If you haven't got his book, it's a compilation of his writings, right? And today is still regarded as one of the foremost art historians in Singapore. And back in the late 70s, I think in 79, he and this Malaysian art critic and artist, Reza Piadasa, they came up with a definition of the Nanyang. But I suppose Sabapati's kind of definition was a bit more convincing, I would say, because by Piadasa's definition, Nanyang, the Nanyang movement actually refers to artists who actually taught at NAFA. And not all artists taught at NAFA. NAFA is the Nanyang Academy of Fine Art. For example, Liu Kang didn't taught at NAFA, right? And there's a wide kind of spread misconception that he taught at NAFA. He didn't. Okay, I believe he taught at Chinese high school, but not at NAFA itself. Okay, but the other major Nanyang artists actually taught at NAFA. Okay, so Sabapati's definition of Nanyang style is this, that is a synthesis. Okay, you can call it a synthesis, syncretism of traditional Chinese ink painting with Western art and, depicting local subject matter. Right, so that was Sabapati's definition of the Nanyang. And till today, I think his definition is still the most authoritative one. Okay, I mean, for myself in my MA program, I kind of challenge my students, to kind of contribute to this discourse on the Nanyang and perhaps, relook at this whole movement. And a couple of them have done so. I think we need more of this kind of discourse, right, in Singapore art. Okay, so Nanyang artists were able to imbue a sense of local consciousness within their works. I think that's a key kind of characteristic of the Nanyang movement. So this kind of my definition is like the Nanyang movement refers to a group of diasporic Chinese artists schooled in both Chinese and Western pictorial tradition in search of a Southeast Asian aesthetic expression. And it belonged to a particular historical period in the 1950s and to some extent the 1960s. So that, I think, is a key point, a particular historical period. Right? I mean, I hear people today, still referring to some works as the Nanyang style. Okay, I think that period has since moved on, right? From, by the 1960s. And they were schooled in both Chinese and pictorial traditions because many of these migrant Chinese artists, they actually went to Europe, particularly Paris, right, to study Western art. Okay, I think with the May 4th movement and all that, a lot of them went to, to the West to study. So they had grounding in both Chinese and Western, right, art. And in 1952, there were 4 artists who made the historic trip to Bali. And, and these 4 artists were Liu Kang, Chen Zhongsui, Chen Wenxi, and Chong Su Ping. Okay, 4 of them. And it's historic because, being migrant artists, they were going to Bali to search for, I suppose, new painting themes. They were searching for new subjects to paint. They were searching for a stimulus as well, right? They were searching for a kind of pictorial representation of this part of the world. Okay, so they went to Bali, right? Okay, so they were searching for a kind of a visual expression that was Southeast Asian. And, after the trip, the sketches they made, the paintings that they produced when they were in Bali, all kind of crystallized, okay, as part of their aesthetic exploration of this region. Right, so that trip and the works that were produced after that, okay, were regarded by scholars like Sabapati as the Nanyang movement. And after the trip, they organized an exhibition. Okay, it's called I think there are a couple of names, but 4 artists to Bali, right? That's one of the names of the exhibition. And, here it's interesting. This, you'll see one important figure at least, or that can kind of recognize, and that's Michael Sullivan. Okay, Michael Sullivan was an important figure, okay, because he was the curator of the University of Malaya Museum. And he was the one who started an art history course in, at that time, the University of Malaya. And Sabapati was his student, right? And you can see him and his Chinese, I can't remember her, I don't remember her nationality, but anyway, that's his wife, Kyun, right? Standing beside him. Right? So an important scholar, right? But he's most noted for his writings on Chinese art. Okay, so there you see him attending this exhibition, and from what you can see in that photograph, okay, you'll see paintings depicting regional and local subject matter. All right. Okay, so that was like a kind of groundbreaking exhibition in Singapore. And I'm going to highlight a few of these Nanyang artists. And the first one, and probably I would say, I won't say who's the greatest, who's the best, but he's probably the most innovative and experimental of all the 4 artists who went to Bali, right? And that's Cheong Su Ping. And he himself said, he used the word experimented, and he experimented a lot, right? In different mediums, on different grounds, right? Mixing mediums together, okay? Presenting different formats, easel format, scroll. Okay, so, really, and he also did sculptures and also metal reliefs. So, a really great kind of experimenter. And he said he went to Bali, and he said he was fascinated by the Balinese woman, It's interesting to find out what actually fascinated him. Actually, one of my students is doing a study now on the relationship between this Nanyang artist and the Balinese woman there, right? Because, we have to find out the kind of exact attitude, okay, of the Nanyang artist towards this Balinese woman. Because we are talking here about the gaze, the male gaze, okay, looking at, or the gendered gaze as well, looking at this, these Balinese who are sometimes also, nude, right, walking around and all that. Okay? So I think that will make for an interesting study. Now, I think all of you own this painting. Do you own it? That's right, you own one. All right, it's at the back of your $50 note. And this painting has, before the National Gallery opened, they've already promoted, this painting quite heavily, and today is regarded as one of the treasures, I would say, right, of our national collection. Okay, Cheong Su Ping's Drying Salted Fish. But I think I'm including this painting not because it's one national, part of national treasure, but I think it shows his Cheong Su Ping's innovation, and it kind of encapsulates the Nanyang kind of style of painting. Okay, and that is to say a mix of, particularly here he uses Chinese ink, right? He still adheres to the ink tradition. You will see, for example, his signature on the left, right? You will see the intricate line work, particularly for the foliage in the foreground, which really reminds you of those that you see in Chinese paintings. Okay, but but other than that, the subject matter itself is local, right? It's local, and he depicts local people, and he has a particular way of depicting the local woman, in his own characteristic way, right? In a sense, they are very stylized. He has exaggerated their facial features, their limbs, right? And to come up with a very particular type of of local woman. Okay? And also, we can also appreciate the patterns on the batik skirts, right, or the batik dress worn by, right, the woman. Right? So here he has successfully, I think, kind of synthesized, okay, Chinese ink tradition, right, with with local subject matter, right? And Dr. Dato' Lok Wan Tho, as I mentioned, who's the founder of Cathay, organization who was himself a collector, and actually he also donated many works to the National Museum. He's a photographer as well. Okay, and this is what he said about Chen Wenxi, right? He said that he talked about line, the line in Chen Wenxi's work, right? The swift, sure, and sentient line, right? And I think that's very characteristic of Chen Wenxi's work, right? But also that he's able to peer through that window which opens onto the Western world. So I suppose if you look at the works of Chen Wenxi, he's someone who is able to switch quite easily between the Chinese ink painting style and a Western style. This work is done in 1965. It's called Grazing. And I know what you think. I mean, when you first look at it, you think, oh, it reminds me of a Cubist work, right? Not exactly Cubist, right? But of course, perhaps, in the kind of Cubist style, I suppose. Okay, and I think one thing that you will notice is the fragmentation, right, of the space. Okay, and especially the cow itself, is, the body of the cow is kind of fractured into this, these crystalline shards, right? But you see here, Wenxi himself does not obey the rules of perspective. Okay, so here perspective itself, in the Western tradition, okay, the one-point perspective is being disregarded, right? In terms of the fragmentation of the pictorial space, right? So here you see the Nanyang artists like Chen Wenxi also sometimes adopting a kind of Western idiom, okay, for their own works, but being also very comfortable with painting in the Chinese style, right? I mean, there are many. I mean, many of his works are painted in the Chinese ink tradition. His famous Gibbon series, for example, right? But today I'm just going to have the time to show you only one work, and I just want to use this work to kind of make that point. And we have Liu Kang, and Liu Kang, if you hear what his contemporaries say about him, he's very highly regarded. And of course, today, you hear criticism of Liu Kang who said that he's a one-style painter, but I don't think that's a very fair assessment. Okay, I mean he's extremely talented, right? And you can never hate his paintings because his paintings are, uses very bright and harmonized colors and flowing, luxuriant lines and all that. So it's very easy to like, and but again, if you look at Liu Kang, this is what he says of his work, right? Again, that synthesis of Western and Chinese, right? And the local subject matter. And I just want to highlight this work. Again, it's considered to be among our national, I would say, treasures, right? This work has been widely depicted. Okay, and it is Life by the River. And here you can see the kind of Chinese sensibility in this work. Okay, I suppose the line work, to some extent, even the perspective. But I think this work is particularly striking for its composition. Okay, and this work, I suppose, revealed Liu Kang to be a kind of a master in composition. Okay, you can see the bridge on the left and the winding river on the right. Okay, they both kind of echo each other. Okay, but at the same time, they also lead your eye to the background, the row of houses in the background. Okay, so there's a kind of unity of expression here. Okay, and there's a kind of symmetry and balance, and you can also see that he places figures all over the painting, right? So that there's a kind of symmetry as well, and colors are also spread throughout the painting. Okay, and I think one particular thing you'll notice is that if you look at the figures, okay, they seem to have no facial expression. There are no, or facial features rather, right? There are no eyes. Okay, some of the faces have no eyes and all that. So it's quite interesting because here Liu Kang, although you can consider this to be a realistic painting, but actually it's not, because if you look at the figures, they are not, precisely painted. Okay, so you can see Liu Kang also kind of experimenting with a kind of, abstraction here, right, in this particular painting, right? And He was, of course, influenced by the early modern art in the West, like Fauvism, right? Particularly Fauvism, and also, the post-impressionist style as well. And of course, I can't leave out, Georgette Chen, who, although she didn't go to the Bali trip, because she only came to Singapore, I think, in 53 or 54. Today she's regarded as an integral member of the Nanyang Movement. Okay, and Georgette Chen here, judging by her self-portrait, it's a very stylish self-portrait. She looks rather distant and a bit aloof, but you can see that she tries to kind of shows her Chinese identity with her signature on the right, and her kind of her dress, and also her, her coiled bun, right? So, judging from what her contemporaries say, she was a very stylish woman with very stylish deportment, right? And most of all, I think she's a cosmopolitan, right? She, now, there's a debate as to where she was born. I think it's something that is not entirely resolved. Okay, so in some sources, you'll see that, you'll read that she's born in France. Okay, but the writer Jane Chia uncovered her marriage certificate, which states that she was born in China, right? But in any case, she lived in 3 different kind of, major places. She lived in France, and then she also studied in New York, and then also in Shanghai. Okay, so she was a real cosmopolitan. And that was what, and that was why, kind of, so that created a kind of aura around her, and, she's well regarded and well respected by students in NAFA. She studied she taught in NAFA for a good 1953 or 54 until about 1981. Okay, so that's almost 3 decades. And she was able to adapt quite quickly to, although a cosmopolitan who has been to New York and Paris, who have seen like the different Western art movement, but still, for her, she said that it's important to depict what she saw around her. Okay, so after she settled in Singapore, she began to depict the local imagery and the local kind of, subject matter here. And she's known most of all for her portraits, okay, her self-portraits, and also her portrait of her husband, Eugene, who was a Chinese foreign minister. And she came, she had a very privileged background. Okay, but very sad life as well. You have seen the 3-part documentary. I think you can download that from the National Gallery, her life is quite, in some ways, tragic, especially the last part. Okay, let me just, this is a quote by Liu Kang on Georgette Chen. All right, and I think maybe, when we assess her, of course, you also need to assess her as an educator. And that was also her contribution. And of course, her most famous student is, she has many famous students. I think one of the most famous is Ng Teng. Okay, she had many students. The sculptor, the late sculptor. Okay. And I think still lifes are probably her most notable works. Right? And in the still life, you can see how she incorporated, local objects, local fruits, rambutans, pomelos, okay, and mooncakes, right, lanterns. Okay, and in her style, right, she was very much influenced by, I suppose, post-impressionism, okay, probably by Cézanne. If you look at the kind of the bold lines that she uses in her works, right. But in terms of subject matter, it's very much localized, right? Okay, but she never forgot her Chinese roots as well. Okay, so you can see on the left, her signature, right? Okay, in the kind of a Chinese style, and also, I suppose, in some ways, the kind of overall Chinese sensibility. But I think her works, like her still lifes, have exudes more a kind of a tropical flavor and feeling, okay, rather than being something more in tune with the West. Okay, another kind of artist who sometimes have been overlooked. Okay, I want to highlight 3 women artists. I think it's very important for us to know these 3 women artists who have also contributed, okay, quite a lot to the Singapore art scene. And one of these artists is Lai Feng Mui. Right? And Lai Feng Mui was actually, coincidentally, the student of Georgette Chen was a teacher. Right? She later won a scholarship to study in Paris, okay, in the Des Beaux-Arts. Okay, and she specialized in a few areas. I mean, still life, she painted still life, genre scenes, portraits. And she painted this portrait, okay, of a laborer taking a lunch break. Right? It's not your kind of usual portrait of, of someone who is powerful or wealthy, but here you have really an ordinary worker, okay, just taking a lunch break. And I think here, what is striking, if you look, is the legs. If you look at the legs, maybe to some extent the hands, and the very chiseled kind of appearance, you can see that she's emphasized these parts, to show the kind of the hard life that he has led, right? But, he also shows that he remains quite stoic and rather dignified, in the face of adversity. Okay? And at the back, it's interesting, right? So at the back, you see a Samsui woman. And I think that's very interesting, because it shows her as she has been all along. I mean, when I refer to she is the Samsui woman, the Samsui women were women who came from Guangzhou, right? Or Guangzhou or Guangdong province in China. Okay, many of them were mostly Cantonese, and they did all the hard work here. Okay, they work in the construction industry, right, bearing heavy stones, and yet, they did it quietly, but they contributed to the development of, what is today Singapore. And it's appropriate that, Lai Feng Mui kind of showed her in the background, taking her meal quietly from a tiffin carrier, right? It's not that she's trying to privilege the male gender over the female gender. I don't think that's the reason, but, it's interesting that she also shows the Samsui woman in the background. And this one is also by Lai Feng Mui. All right, this is in the NLB collection. I think this is in, somewhere around. Okay. And again, in a sense, quite different from Georgette Chen's work. I mean, this particular still life is really in the Western tradition. It's a kind of conventional still life where you actually use apples, right? So hence, the title of the work, 3 apples on the table. All right. But here she also plays with horizontal kind of lines, as can be seen in the table, right? And also vertical lines, with the curtains and the walls, right? So you have that kind of horizontal and verticals here, right? Rather severe kind of painting, formal kind of, kind of like a study, right, of those objects. And I want to highlight a third woman artist, and that is Sun Yee. Yeah, yesterday, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who's quite an established visual artist. I won't name him, but so I told him about my talk, and I told him that I'm going to talk about Sun Yee, right? And he said he has not heard of Sun Yee. I said, you have to know who Sun Yee is, right? Anyone here? Can I have a show? Honestly, have you heard of Sun Yee? Yes, of course. Oh, hello, Sang. Miss Sang made it, right? Okay, yes, only Miss Dang heard of Sun Yee. I mean, of course, some of the senior artists here, right? You've probably heard of Sun Yee. Yeah, Sun Yee is, I would say, quite an important figure in the Singapore painting history. Okay, she studied in the Xinhua, kind of academy, where many of the Nanyang artists also studied. Okay, and she also studied in the University of Tokyo, University of Arts in Tokyo. And she also studied in Paris under the famous cubist painter Fernand Léger. Right? So she had a kind of distinguished background. And she came in about 1954 to Singapore. And actually she was invited to head this school called the Singapore Art Academy. Anyone of you heard? You have heard of LASALLE and NAFA, but not Singapore Art Academy. All right? It has since shut down. Okay, I think it's no longer operating. And But she was the dean and I think the principal of the Singapore Art Academy. Right. Okay, so I think she has made a very important contribution to the Singapore art scene. And I think she's a figure that everyone needs to know about. But unfortunately, there's very little writing on her. Okay, I think there's a scholar who has written about her for a PhD, okay, looking at women here, okay, as professional artists, but I think very few writings, right, besides that. So San Yi, she's notable for famous for her drawings or paintings of flowers. Okay, I think it was 1957 where she held an exhibition called Flowers on Nanyang, in which she depicted local and regional flora, right, using a Chinese ink style. And this painting is Christina Lok. Now, who is Christina Lok? She's the wife of Lok Wan To. Right? Here, I don't know whether it's whether she actually was participating in an opera or, whether she just dressed up for this particular portrait. Okay, but I think it's a very endearing portrait, right? At least to me, right? The very friendly eyes, the vivacious smile, right? And also in terms of composition, you can see how she tries to achieve a unity of colors, right? The color of the background, with the colors of the flower on the costume, right? So the artist here tries to kind of achieve that kind of unity or synthesis of colors as well. So at that time, as I said at the beginning of my talk, is that there was a proliferation of art societies and collectives, and these are just some of them. Okay, you have the Singapore Society, which was really the first kind of multi-racial society in Singapore, because previously societies were divided along racial lines. You have the Society of Malay Artists, Society of Chinese Artists, right? So this was, Singapore Art Society was really the first kind of racial society. And it was founded by a number of artists, I would say including Richard Walker, right, who was the first art educator sent by the British to Singapore. Okay, and I suppose Liu Kang also was a leading figure of the Singapore Society. In any case, Liu Kang was always, he's one of the judges, right, in the Singapore Art Society. And then we have the Nanyang Movement, as I mentioned earlier. Equator, I'm going to talk about in the next slide. The Tenman Group also, I'll be talking about briefly. Modern Art Society, the Molan Arts Association. Some associations or societies were divided, they were grouped under a certain teacher. So the Molan Arts Association, they were students of this artist called Si Yang To, right? Also quite an established artist, also overlooked in some ways, right, in our narrative here. And then, of course, you have the Singapore Watercolour Society, which I'm also going to touch on, right, in the second half of my talk. Okay, so the Singapore Equator Art Society, okay, what they depicted is that they depicted, the social and political realities of Singapore, right? They adopted what you call a social realist style of painting. Now, just take a second or two to read this quote, okay? Now, this quote was actually found in an exhibition catalog. Now, how many times, how often do you come across such quotes in, or writings in exhibition catalogues, right? Where the first line says, the independence of Singapore has been brutally denied by the British government. Okay? And this can only deepen the anguish of Singaporeans. Right? And the objectives of our exhibition is to promote patriotism with artworks of relevant subject matter and form. Now, I won't go so far as to the extent of saying that the works of the Equator Society artists, are actually propagandistic. Okay? But they certainly embody certain ideological position. Right. So the artists who belong to the Equator Society, I suppose they sympathize, with elements all right, who were clamoring for independence from the British. Okay, and those elements were normally the leftist elements, you know. I mean, to put it bluntly, you know, they were the British regarded them as communists, right? Okay, and so their kind of art responded, okay, to, you know, the political situation that was going on, right, in Singapore at that time. Okay, so what was the Equator Society? Okay, it was a collective founded in 1956, okay, that promoted social realist art and was nationalistic and anti-colonialist in its stance. Okay, and it responded to the tumultuous political realities in Singapore at that time, the riots and the strikes, you know, and the struggles of the working classes, right? And okay, and woodcut was a favorite medium. Okay, but of course, you know, because this is like a talk on painting, okay, I'm not going to show any woodcuts today. But woodcuts was a favorite medium because it was easily produced and easily disseminated, right? Now, something I wanted to talk about that slipped my mind. It was, I think, kind of, it was deregistered, right? The Equator Society was deregistered in about early 70s, about 1973. Okay, and there's again speculation as to why it was deregistered, right? You know, but as I said, but you know, we just take it that, you know, after the 1970s, it was kind of, yeah, we no longer hear about it. And today, the artists associated with this Equator Society, you know, this particular exhibition, you know, artists like Chua Mia Tee, Lee Boon Wang, Lim Yu Kwan, all participated. Okay, and today they've gone on to paint other things. Okay, some of them have just gone on to paint works which can be considered to be like decorative mementos, you know, like, you know, fish, koi, and, you know, birds and all that. Okay, they no longer were, you know, paint kind of the political realities of, right, like what they did, right, in the 50s and probably the 60s. Now, talking about national treasures, this is another one, right? In fact, this, I mean, it's so well regarded that it gave its name to the gallery, right? If you go to the gallery, is it the gallery's name? Is Siapa Nama Kamu? Is that the Singapore gallery's name? It is, right? Okay, if you go to the National Gallery, so it's named after this paint. I mean, not this painting, but it's named after what was written on the board behind. Okay, so what's happening here is that in this painting by Chua Mia Tee called the National Language Class, you have a cikgu. A cikgu is a Malay teacher, right? He's conducting a class, right? You know, teaching students the Malay language, and written on the board are two phrases: Siapa nama kamu and di mana awak tinggal, meaning where do you live? What is your name? Right? Now, to you, this may seem like just an ordinary class, language class taking place, right? But as I said, what is so interesting about art is this, that you can interpret a painting. Okay, and that's what, you know, some writers and even historians have done. Okay, they have read against the grain, meaning to say that they look beyond the surface of this painting. Okay, so to them it's more than just a language class taking place. And for that kind of interpretation, you need evidence. Right? And there are several evidence here. For example, the year 1959. You know, that was a year, I think, when Singapore kind of got its self-government. Okay, I think it was a year also where the Malay language was adopted as the official language. And of course, the political situation was still very chaotic, right? Okay, so the painting must be seen in that context as well. And knowing that Chua Mia Tee was a member of the, you know, the Equator Society is also another evidence, right? Okay, so it led some scholars and historians to say that, well, you know, this painting is nationalistic in its intention, right? If you look at the phrases, it's about a sense of self, it's about identity, it's about a sense of place, right? Okay, and again, when we do kind of interpretation, we need to look at the other works of the artists. Okay, in art historical term, we call this intertextual references. So if we look at his other work, this was earlier done in 1955. It's called the epic poem Malaya. Okay, and that one was, of course, an indoor kind of class. This one is an outdoor. I don't know whether this is a class per se, as in, a teacher with a student. I mean, some people have seen it that way. It's, those are the students and you have a teacher teaching a class. But it might not be. Okay, it could just be an orator. He's an orator, definitely, right? And he's reading an imaginary poem about Malaya. But judging from the title again, okay, Malaya. Here you have, people at that time who were clamoring for a kind of Malayan identity. Okay, they wanted independence from the British. All right. So that at once, makes this picture of, a rather political one as well. And I think the orator here is really a powerful man. He has powerful gestures. And if you look at what's interesting are the different visual expression or facial expressions of the people there, right? They range from teenagers to adults, okay? And again, judging by the clothing, some of the students actually come from those Chinese medium schools, which were at that time a kind of hotbed for, the kind of leftist elements. So you might even go to the extent of saying that this was a cell taking place, a kind of communist cell, a meeting, right, taking place, right? We could even go to the extent. So that kind of lends substantiation to the argument that, this is more than just a language class taking place, right? Okay, it's about the idea of, you see the different races there again, right? You have Indians, you have Eurasians, Chinese, Malay, okay? That kind of, Malay identity that, the Equator Society and some of the leftist kind of, elements were trying to kind of forge, right, in Singapore at that time. Okay, this I showed you this because it's from the NLB collection. I think you can see in one of the floors, right? But this one was done much later. It was like a few decades later. It's also by Chomyati. But here you can see that he's still trying to depict the struggles of the lower classes, the working classes. Okay, you see again the Samsui woman, and then a fishmonger, right? But in the last, I would say, decade or couple of decades, he has just been producing, commercial works, right? Not really, kind of being in tune with, the social and political realities here. I think it'll be interesting if some of the senior artists, would kind of engage with the social and political realities, right? But that's just my opinion, right? Sometimes you also need to, bread and butter issues are also quite, also important, I suppose. Okay, after the Bali trip, okay, I suppose the Bali trip inspired other artists here to make similar trips overseas. And one of this group, okay, is called the Tenman Group. Tenman. Actually, it's a misnomer, okay, because it also comprised women, right? I think at the peak of, where you had 16 members, I think there were 3 women artists in this group. Okay, and the Tenman Group, they made 6 trips altogether, mainly to Southeast Asia. Okay, and notice that they didn't attempt to go to the West, or Paris or New York. Okay, again, they wanted to find the inspiration in this region. Okay, and the leader of the group, okay, or at least the one who organized all the trips, okay, was this artist called Ye Chi Wei. Okay, Ye Chi Wei. Let me just show you a photograph. Okay, this is where they made the trip to Java and Bali, right, in 1962. I think before 2009, okay, 2009 was when the national, well, at that time, it was at the Singapore Museum. Okay, so they had an exhibition at the Singapore Museum, and that exhibition was an exhibition on Ye Chi Wei. But before 2009, not many people have heard of Ye Chi Wei. Right? Even the curator, one of the curators who curated the show, said that before the show, she had never heard of Ye Chi Wei. Right? He was very prominent in the 60s and 70s, but then he faded from the scene when he went back to Malaysia. Okay? And only rediscovered, right, back in the 2000s. Okay? And today, people have regarded him as a highly, unique and distinctive artist. Okay, and you can clearly see from his work here, right? This one is Dayak men. I mean, showing a couple of Dayak men, involved in a sport of cockfighting. Okay, and it's very unique because, his style alone. He uses black. Now, how many artists use black? Okay, so black was really the dominant color of his work. Okay. And I suppose he used black for a reason as well, right? He wanted his work to, he drew inspiration from several sources. Okay, sources like Chinese ink rubbings. Okay, I suppose that also accounts for the black in his work. Okay, he drew references or sources from the ancient Chinese script. You can see the script there is those script you'll find on oracle bones, right? And also, if you look at his work, even the shape, of the work itself, okay, it's like him carving, from a stone or a rock, okay? He was also influenced by stone carving to some extent, right? And overall, it gives that kind of primordial or primitive quality, right? That is truly unique, I would say. Okay? So, even this work encapsulates that sense of modernity, right? Because it's an innovative, extremely innovative work. And this is what Ye Chi Wei, right, kind of said, that he was influenced by Chinese woodblock print, stone engraving, oracle bone inscriptions, okay, and yes, and he said that he wanted to imbue oil pigments with an ink characteristic. So he didn't use ink, but he actually used oil pigment, okay, but giving that kind of oil pigment a kind of ink characteristic. Okay, I think that's quite interesting as well. Okay, next I'm just going to go through the, I'm coming towards the end of my talk, and this is the Modern Art Society, right, and it was formed in 1964 by, I don't know whether it's by a number of artists as well. And one of course, the leading figure of the Modern Art Society is Ho Ho Ying. Okay, Ho Ho Ying, he's acknowledged as the leader of the Modern Art Society, and also the voice, because he was the one who wrote the kind of, I won't say the manifestos, but some of the writings, most of the writings were actually done, right, by him. And the Modern Society kind of advocated a kind, what you call an art for art's sake approach. And I hope you kind of understand this term, art for art's sake. Okay, meaning that art was not made to kind of convey any kind of moral or social or political kind of, issues. But, it was just creating for the sake of, appreciating the formal beauty of a work, right? Meaning to say that, art for art's sake kind of, it did away with representational art. Okay, if you like, abstract art is what is art for art's sake. And Ho Ho Ying kind of he critiqued, for example, the Equator Society. Okay, he actually accused them of lacking creativity because they were concerned with, social realist works. And they said that is not really creativity. So you have, as I said, competing, kind of movements as well during this period, which was what made this period interesting. And that is what he says, He says that, realism has passed its golden age, it's gone. Impressionism is also gone. Fauvism and cubism are declining. If you look at Fauvism and cubism, although it represented modern art, but it didn't quite do away with the subject. right? You can still recognize, the subject or the object in a cubist work, right? So he wanted, even more, and he says that art, like all things in the world, is ever changing, and we are trying to catch up with the change. So what was happening in the 1950s, 1960s in Europe and in America is that artists were experimenting with abstraction, pure abstraction. Okay, actually pure abstraction, you can find it, even in the 20s or even earlier, right, in the works of people like Kandinsky and Mondrian. Okay, so in the 50s or the late 40s, you have the abstract expressionist movement in America, which had a significant influence on artists in Singapore and I think even in the region. But having said that, artists were influenced by, movements in the West like abstract expressionism, which Ho Ho Ying was, right? Okay, some of his paintings you can see is like, well, you can say that, well, it's like, it's like what Jackson Pollock, right, painted. Okay, but in works like this, okay, he kind of, showed that he also can have a unique style. Right? It is expressionistic in some ways. You see the freely brushed background, right? You see the kind of, the expressionist forms in the foreground, the white kind of forms, okay, in the foreground, kind of dancing on the canvas, hence, giving rise to the title of the work, Rhythm of Dance. Okay, but you can see that he still retains the kind of, the Chinese sensibility in his work. Right, and that can be seen, for example, in the very spontaneous lines, right, in the work, okay, and also the kind of calligraphic lines that you see, right, in this work. And I have a quote by Lim Chong Kiat. Now, Lim Chong Kiat was also a very important figure, okay, because he's a driving force behind this gallery called Alpha Gallery, okay, and Alpha Gallery, was a kind of a a famous gallery in the 70s, right? It was managed by, the number of artists there. And it was really the gallery who dared to show works by young artists. And also dared to show abstract art. Okay, so Alpha Gallery was an important gallery at that time in the 1970s. And Lim Chong Kiat says that, referring to Ho, that he has arrived at a very distinctive and assured control of textures and abstract forms. And if you look at his work, it's very different from the kind of tumultuous, expressionism of Pollock and de Kooning in the West. He has a kind of contemplative quality, right? More in tune with, the Chinese pictorial tradition, right, than the Western tradition. At least for this particular work. And then we have the so-called second generation artists. Now, I always regard labels, I'm quite wary of labels, first generation, second generation. Then where's your third generation, fourth generation? Do we have them? We stop at the second generation, right? Okay, but I think this term is used to refer to students who were mainly, artists who were mainly students of the Nanyang artists. Okay, so many of them studied under Zhong Su Ping, Chairman Si, Georgette Chen, okay, and people like that. And many of them, not many, but some of them at least, okay, and these were the ones who got the most exposure, okay, and got most written about, right? And this group of artists, they actually went overseas to study, okay, to UK and to America. And they were the ones who, got more exposure than artists who continued to stay in Singapore. Okay, and these were artists who I felt have been overlooked, right? In the kind of second generation artists who have been overlooked. Okay, and they adopted a kind of modern abstract language. Okay, some of them at least. Okay, notably Anthony Poon. Okay, Anthony Poon, who is really a formalist. His works really, if you look at his works as a whole, okay, you can say that in the West is equivalent to, this movement called op art, OP, op. Okay, where colors, shapes, lines, okay, textures and all that. I mean, there are no textures really. He has eliminated textures and you know, and bright colors, at least textures and brush strokes altogether from this work. Okay, but he has arranged other things like colors and shapes, okay, lines, you know, he has manipulated them, you know, to give a kind of optical illusion, all right? So here you can see either, you know, he has kind of two kind of diamond shapes kind of intersecting, or he has combined them, or you can look at it as 7, you know, kind of, you know, diamond shapes. So it all depends on how you look. So he's creating that kind of, he's playing your perception, right, of how you are looking at this work. And also, if you look at the lines, right, it kind of, towards the middle, the lines have been, you know, undulating, right? That also creates a sense of movement in the work as well, right? Okay. So for this kind of work, you need mathematical precision. You need a lot of discipline and rigor. Okay, and that was how Anthony Poon worked, right? There's a kind of clarity and logic in this work. It is definitely belong to the category of art for art's sake. It's autonomous, meaning to say that, you know, it makes no references at all to what's, in a sense, what's going on, right, in the world, right, in the social, political world. Okay. And Anthony Poon has successfully kind of translated his two-dimensional works into sculptures, right? Today, his sculptures are displayed around Singapore, right? In fact, he has gone from flat surfaces to, you know, to more, to kind of sculptural protrusions, right, in some of his two-dimensional works as well, right? So he has progressed to, you know, over the years, right? But he has passed away, right? Sadly, I think through cancer, I think some years ago. And this is what he says, and he says, I repeat patterns in my painting, right? And why pattern? Because he says you need repetition for energy. That's why you repeat patterns. Okay. The other artists who you know, more prominent artists of this so-called second generation artist is Teo Eng Seng. Okay, and Teo Eng Seng, he painted in the style of the abstract expressionist painters, right, back in the 60s and 70s. But in the late 80s, when he was teaching at the United World College of Southeast Asia, right, he started to wonder about his art. Okay, and you know, and he saw, you know, and making paper kind of gave him an idea, right, especially working with his Japanese students, right. And he said that, you know, he wanted to make something or create something that, you know, identify his art with this part of the world, right? So he began to work with paper. He began to process paper, pulp, right? Okay, and that, you know, made his art very distinctive and unique. I mean, till today, I've not come across an artist who, like, you know, work in, you know, in this kind of style where he actually made and processed his own paper, and with that, you can actually stain and color your paper any way you want to. You can combine them, right? You can create different textures, colors. Okay, and that resulted in this works that is known as paper dye sculpt. If you look at the caption there, right, paper dye sculpt. Okay, and I think what's interesting here is that he also made references to his own kind of local or Chinese tradition, right? You'll see kind of folk prints, you know, those kind of symbol of good luck, you know, that he incorporates into this work. Okay, and the depression that you see there was done by, you know, those wooden clocks, you know, that, you know, olden days you used to wear, right? But I think what's significant about this paper dye sculpt is that, as Teo Eng Seng himself said, he wanted to defy categorization. Okay, so this kind of work has blurred the boundaries. It has blurred the boundaries between painting and sculpture. Okay, and that to me is a kind of, you know, a mark of innovation and experimentation. Oh, coming to Mr. Ang's work, okay, Ang Ati, and Mr. Ang has kindly kind of sent me, you know, I wanted a work of his from the 70s, but couldn't find any, you know, so I you know, kind of contacted him, and, you know, he has sent me this, and to give a background of Mr. Ang, he graduated from NAFA in '62, but didn't really become a full-time artist until 1977. Okay, and I read that, you know, from then until now, he has produced over 2,000 works, maybe even more, right? And that is really prolific. I mean, 2,000 paintings. Okay, and he won the Cultural Medallion in 2003. Oh, nine. Okay, and okay. So in any case, he has kind of also developed his own kind of distinctive style that really displays his technical skill. Okay, I think for Ang Ati is really all about techniques, right? His painting, and this early work, I think, shows that he's still in that process of discovering his work. You know, that was to later crystallize into his more mature works. And this was a scene that he saw in Chiang Mai, in Thailand. He shows two women weaving. Okay, and he likes to work with a palette knife. Okay, and in these early years, he was still working in oil. Okay, so although you can still see the brown, you know, the kind of somber colors, the brown, the umber colors. Okay, other than that, it is not as richly textured as, you know, you can see it, you know, it's kind of weathered and all that, and that's done through the, you know, using a palette knife to apply the paint, but it's not as richly textured or kind of encrusted, you know, compared to his later works, right? The figures are still quite well defined, okay, compared to his later works like this, right? And you know, this was done in 2000. And I think this is really, you know, his kind of signature style, right? And Ang is known as, you know, he a painter of landscapes. Okay, I think to be more specific, cityscapes, village-scapes, you know, townscapes. But I think buildings kind of fascinate him, and you know, he liked to depict buildings in his work, right? And he also, you know, previously also liked to, you know, kind of depict the Singapore River as well. But as I said, this kind of work was done, and it was after, I think, 77 or so, or later on, where he used acrylic instead of oil. And I think that also made a difference in his work. Okay, but he still used the palette knife to apply his paint. Okay, and I think here, if you look at this work, you know, it created a kind of work that is richly textured, you know, with a kind of a highly encrusted surface. You can see that the buildings and notably the boats in the foreground, you know, even the river, I think, right? They are obliterated by, you know, his highly textured, you know, strokes. Okay, so much so that, you know, some of the elements in the painting are unrecognizable, right? Okay, so his works are not, in a sense, they're not meant to be a kind of exact representation of a scene, but really a suggestion, right, of what he sees and observes. Okay, and I think that's what gives his work a kind of distinctive quality. Okay, Singapore River, you know, it was a very popular motif. Okay, I don't know whether it's still a popular motif today, but many, I mean, it became so popular that some contemporary artists reacted against it, right? Okay, and you know, but in the 70s, it was you know, a very popular subject among artists. Okay, because of the tongkangs there, the row of terrace houses, the hustle and bustle of it. Okay, and not to mention that it's the economic lifeline, okay, of Singapore, right? And so, you know, talking about the Watercolour Society, was formed in 1969. Okay, and one of the founding members was Chen Zhongsui, okay, who was a Nanyang artist. And I don't know whether Ong Kim Seng was one of the founders, but you know, he definitely was a member of the society. Okay, and we are told that every Sunday, they will go to the Singapore River, members of the Watercolour Society. They'll set up the easel there, okay, they'll paint the Singapore River, right? And then after that, after lunch, they would then gather around to discuss, I suppose to discuss the merits of what they've painted. And younger artists would learn from the more senior artists, right? So that was what was happening, you know, back in the 70s. And of course, today when we talk about watercolor, okay, Ong Kim Seng is arguably the foremost kind of living watercolor artist. But we have other kind of young emerging exciting watercolor artists as well, like Aaron behind, Aaron Gunn, right? Okay, and a couple of others, you know, if I miss anyone. Yeah, and Ong Kim Seng, you know, this is what he says. He loved the medium for its unpredictability, okay, and its ability to convey light and atmosphere. And I think that is characteristic of Ong Kim Seng's work, okay, capturing the changing effects of light, right, in his work. And he was, I don't know whether he still is, but he used to be the only Asian artist who was a member of the American Watercolour Association, right? I think by winning a certain number of awards, you get automatically incorporated, right, as a member. That's a young Ong Kim Seng, self-taught. He was a former police officer, former graphic designer, right? And today he has become very successful, okay, commercially as well. Right? And Ong Kim Seng, like many of the artists that we have seen today, like to go overseas to paint because in Singapore there's only, it's so small and the subject matter is limited. So they go overseas to paint, and you can also capture different effects of light as well. And here, it's a work in Kathmandu in Nepal, and he liked to paint buildings as well, man-made structures. Okay, and he himself said that he saw himself as continuing where the architects and the builders left off. Right, so by painting this, architecture of buildings, he's actually continuing the work of the architects and builders. So he saw himself as kind of middleman between, the building itself and the viewer. Right. And really, I mean, if you look at this, this painting the whole is atmospheric, is suffused with warm light, okay, and yeah, all in all, a delightful kind of depiction of, of Kathmandu. And you have Lim Cheng Ho. There's a little debate as to, I mean, inevitably when you go into discussion of watercolor, there's always this discussion about, who is the better artist, Ong Kim Seng or Lim Cheng Ho. Okay, somehow you'll kind of drift into this. But anyway, I don't want to go into that kind of debate, right? There's also Yong Man Seng and a few others who are equally as, as good. But Lim Cheng Ho, he's unlike the other Chinese migrant artists. He had a British education. He studied under Richard Walker in Raffles Institution, right? So Richard Walker was, so he was schooled in the kind of the Chinese, the watercolor medium, because watercolor was a medium taught in schools at that time in Singapore. Okay, so this is, again, Singapore River, and very nice nice painting in the sense that he uses a wet-on-wet technique, giving a kind of watery feel, atmospheric feel to the whole painting. And notice how he uses the row of boats, as a dividing line, dividing the scene, the background, consisting of buildings done in vague washes of grays. In the foreground, you have a single boat there, right? And how he's able to capture the kind of the warm, kind of, glowing light as well in this painting. Right. I think this is available. You can see this in the National Gallery in Singapore, if I'm not mistaken. And three more slides. This is in the NLB collection. You can see this again in one of the floors. Right? And I will encourage you to go and see it. Right? It's really a good painting by Chu Keng Kwang. And Chu Keng Kwang, he graduated from NAFA and he taught there, right, as well after that. And he could work with many mediums, right? He's also known for his woodcuts, right? And I don't know, I think he was also a member of the Equator, right? So in the 50s, he also used to produce, kind of social realist works. But here, in this work, he sought to capture another part of the Singapore River, not so much the hustle and bustle, okay, of the trading that was going on there, but he was, he captured this opera stage, right, and with a crowd looking at it, okay, and Chu Keng Kwang worked in a kind of impressionistic style, right? As you can see, although you can clearly see the people there, they are not so well defined, right? Okay, and also I think what's delightful about this painting is that He uses colors quite selectively, okay, but enough to kind of draw your eyes to, to certain parts of the painting, right, creating a very delightful work. Okay, we must not forget that there are many artists today who still work with ink, right? Some artists are still working in the kind of Chinese pictorial tradition, okay, but other artists have gone on to experiment with ink. Okay, notably the late Chua Ek, right? Chua Ek also, yeah, he has since passed on, okay? But filling the void left by Chua Ek, I would say, right? I mean, after Chua Ek's death, right, really, I mean, you have the ascendancy of Lim Tze-ping, right? Because really, I mean, when Chua Ek was alive, I think a lot of attention was given to him. But I think for Lim Tze-ping, who has started to practice way back in the I think in the 60s or even the 70s, but he only received that recognition, I think, in the 2000s, right? In the 2000s, and this is what he says. In 73, he began to work in Chinese ink. Okay, but he wanted to steer clear of the stereotypical subject, meaning that those subjects you find in Chinese painting. Okay, so like the Chinese migrant, like the Nanyang artists, right, that I've mentioned, whom he was closely associated with, like Chong Su Ping and people like that. Okay, he also depicted the local subject matter here, the kelongs and the kampongs and all that, right, done in Chinese ink. And I think thanks to him, okay, today, although all those buildings that you see in Chinatown and the area around Chinatown, they have been razed, to the ground, as part of the modernization, urbanization process. Lim Tze-ping has captured them forever on canvas. And I think he foresaw that happening. And we are told that, like, Mr. Choi Wing-yang tells us that, at one stage he was just painting. He had a kind of ink bliss, where he would go out and painted for days at a stretch, just trying to capture those scenes before they disappear forever, right? So his works also serve as an important documentation of, not only of the Singapore art scene, but of Singapore itself. Okay. Today, of course, and I mean, this was one of his, I think, I don't have the date, sorry, but I think this was, this can be dated back to the 80s. Where he was capturing a lot of these scenes, right, around Chinatown and all that. So, and if you look at Lim Tze-ping's work, he was really a master of the ink stroke. And that can be attributed to his training as a calligrapher, right? Training, as say that, he rigorously practiced calligraphy daily, right? And, and that helped to give power and strength and rhythm to his own work, right? So one thing you'll notice is really his ink work, right? In his drawings, his paintings, and also the rich. What you'll notice also is the rich tonalities, the rich tonal details in his work, right? And for this work, the lines are still very fine, but later on, as he progressed, the lines got bolder and bolder, right? Okay, and later on, this was to kind of crystallize into his, his calligraphic works as well, right? Where he kind of blurs the boundaries between calligraphy and art, right? Okay, so this is a depiction of morning markets. Okay, you can see the stalls there and the buildings. And this is my last slide, right? Wu Saiyan. Wu Saiyan has been in the scene for a long time. In fact, he taught at NAFA, I think back in the 40s, right, if I'm not mistaken. And he is known notably as a finger painter. He painted with his fingers. Right, he's arguably the foremost finger painter in Singapore and Malaya. Okay, and he had achieved recognition in both America and Europe for his work. But even though he painted with his finger, as you can see in this work, he never compromised the kind of the scholarly tradition. He still painted in the Chinese scholarly tradition, right? So even when he painted with his fingers, you can see the details there in this work, right? And how he contrasted the strength, of the pine tree, of the bark of the pine tree, the branch of the pine tree with the leaves of the pine tree. Okay, and of course, pine is a symbol of longevity, right? In Chinese art. Okay, so you see here, Wu Sayan, I thought I would include him because, it's a unique style of painting, right? Painting your finger, right? And I think he also played an important role as well in, the art history here in Singapore. So this is my question, is painting dead today, right? I think it's something for us to question, right? Having seen, all those works created during a span of 2 to 3 decades, right? But today, we don't see many. I mean, I see some young painters. I mean, there's a little revival in painting, right? Especially those who graduated from my school in LaSalle, right? I mean, it's encouraging to see them, doing paintings again. But today, if you look at contemporary art, really contemporary art is dominated by, other kinds of art forms: performance, installation, video, photography, right? So I like to end there, and if you have any question, maybe you can take a couple of questions.
I actually have 2 questions. The first is there anything written about the relationship between the pioneer artists? Apparently some of them knew each other before they came here. In other words, was it a friendly competition, or did they enjoy learning from one another, or were they hostile to one another? It's kind of interesting that you could group them together, and that I found, at least in English, it's difficult to understand what their relationship was. And then the second question, because I think this is difficult to answer, but anyway, the second question is, when you talked about the Equator Art Society, they said, oh, well, we're not going to paint in a Western style. Well, what did they think social realism was?
I'm very curious because all the works that you've shown, most of the artists that you have talked about, they are all Chinese. What was going on with Singapore art in among the Malay community or other artists? Because we've not really heard very much about that, and I'm sure there was something going on there as well, right? Thank you.
Your expansion of modernity, I hope that I would ask is whether you would intend to expand that, because you show these decades, and whether you can look before that. Because for me, I mean, when you talk about modernity in art in Singapore, you can stretch that all the way back to Raffles. That's a very modern piece of art, him coming here and then appropriating elements. It's a new form, it's a new order. And if you talk about nationalism, like when you spoke about that, and saying, well, you reject British, and then you say you incorporate local elements. Again, local elements have been used long ago. And if you say, and I was looking at the Equator art and the Chinese, these Chinese, actually we Chinese, we are the colonizers too. We were brought here because of the British. If you think about it, the indigenous people were removed in this island. So if you talk about that, our expansion, what I mean is that these definitions that you have talked about, these parameters, yes, but I hope that, we can expand that as we talk about it. Look upon it differently,
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that that's, in our local art history, especially in the writing of our art history, in the research, I think there's a lot to left to do, right? And I think that's why, for my own MA program, I always encourage students to kind of not to accept, what they read, but to challenge them, Even, as you said, the definition of modernism or modernity, right, in the context of Singapore art, which can definitely be stretched to earlier, right, even to the time of the British here, right. So I think that's something that is definitely worth thinking about and researching and writing, right, definitely. And I think there's so much to do, and and hopefully we can kind of fill the gap, in those areas, right. And coming to your question about the exclusion of artists of other races, that was not done consciously. Sorry, it's because I think of course there are other races kind of practicing as well. There was a society of Malay artists. There was a society of Indian artists. Okay, but again, unfortunately, not much research has been done on these artists, especially in that period I'm talking about, from the 50s to the 70s. Even if you go to the National Gallery, you don't see many works by Malay artists. Okay, Abdul Ghani Hamid is probably the most famous among the, the Malay artists practicing in that period, right? So again, I mean, I must apologize if I kind of didn't include, right, works by, artists of other races. It was not intentional, okay? But I think really, if you talk about Singapore art, it's really dominated by Chinese artists, I would say, right? Especially during this period that we are talking about, right? So I hope it answers your. I think more research needs to be done. Okay, my students have undertaken research on Malay artists. I've always encouraged them. I say, look at Malay artists, in Singapore. So I think in the last few years there have been quite a lot of interest in Malay artists. Okay, but not so much, for example, on Indian artists. So that's another challenge I want to give, give people, look at, who are some of the Indian artists who practiced at that time. Again, it's not easy to find information, right? There was a society of Indian artists as well, right? Okay, and of course, there are all the kind of expatriate artists who are practicing here, but I didn't really include them, right, in the talk.